The wash-house stood behind the mansion like an afterthought, low and windowless, its brick walls darkened by decades of steam and soot. From dawn until long after the city bells marked evening, heat poured from its narrow door, carrying the sour smell of boiled linen, lye soap, and human exhaustion. Inside, the laundress worked alone most days, her body bent over tubs so large they seemed to swallow her whole. The water was always near boiling, kept that way to scrub the wealth of the house clean, blood from scraped knees, sweat from silk gowns, wine spilled during dinners where laughter never reached her ears. Charleston, beyond the mansion gates, bustled with carriages, church bells, and polite conversation, but none of that entered the wash-house. Here, time was measured in armfuls of wet cloth and the slow burn of heat against skin. Her hands were permanently raw, the flesh cracked and swollen, the scars so old they no longer stung, only throbbed, as if reminding her that pain had once been sharp enough to matter. She had learned early not to cry out. Tears were noticed, and being noticed always brought punishment. Her mistress ruled the household with an authority that did not require raised voices. A glance was enough, a pause heavy with expectation. She wore her cruelty lightly, as one might wear jewelry, flashing it only when she wished to remind others of her position. To the guests, she was refined, charitable, devout. To the servants, she was precise in her humiliations. Mistakes were never accidents in her eyes, they were personal insults. And the laundress, always hidden behind steam and shadows, bore the worst of it. Each morning baskets arrived overflowing with linen, sheets damp with sweat, dresses stiff with perfume, undergarments stained and knotted with secrets the mistress never acknowledged. The laundress scrubbed them all the same. She learned the weight of different fabrics, the way silk slipped between fingers while cotton clung like an accusation. She knew which garments belonged to which member of the household, could tell moods by the stains left behind. Anger left sharp marks. Indulgence left heavier ones. The work taught her far more about her masters than they ever intended to reveal. Sometimes the mistress visited the wash-house, stepping carefully to avoid damp patches on the floor, holding a handkerchief to her nose as if the air itself offended her. These visits were rarely announced. The laundress would feel her presence before hearing her voice, a tightening in the chest, a warning learned through repetition. The mistress would inspect the work, lifting a sheet or dress with 2 fingers, her eyes narrowing at the smallest imperfection. A missed spot, a lingering crease, a hint of discoloration. Each was an opportunity to assert control. "You grow careless," she would say, her voice cool and measured. "Or perhaps you grow lazy." The laundress never answered. She had learned silence was safer than explanation. Explanation invited debate, and debate invited punishment. Instead, she lowered her eyes and worked harder, her arms aching, her breath shallow in the thick air. The mistress would leave satisfied, her authority reaffirmed, unaware or uninterested in the quiet storm her presence stirred. The washtub itself was a monster of iron and water, blackened by years of use. It took hours to heat properly, the fire beneath it carefully fed, the water stirred to keep it from scorching the fabric. The laundress tended it like a living thing, knowing when it was too hot, when it needed more wood, when it threatened to boil over. Steam coated the ceiling, dripped down the walls, soaked her clothes until they clung to her skin. The heat pressed in from all sides, relentless, inescapable. It was in that heat that memories surfaced most clearly, faces long gone. A mother's voice, low and soothing, cut short one night and never heard again. A child's laugh that faded as quickly as it had appeared. The plantation had taken everything from her except endurance, and even that felt borrowed at times. Each day in the wash-house was a reminder of what had been stripped away, scrubbed out, boiled until nothing recognizable remained. The other servants rarely lingered near the wash-house. They passed quickly, dropping baskets at the door, avoiding the steam and the solitude that seemed to cling to the place. They spoke to her in murmurs when they did speak at all, their eyes darting as if the walls themselves might report them. Everyone knew the wash-house was where punishments hid, where screams were softened by steam and distance. It was a place the mistress favored for privacy. One afternoon, the laundress made a mistake, a small one, invisible to anyone but the mistress. a lace collar, still damp, folded and placed atop a basket before it had fully dried. The mistress noticed immediately. She held it up to the light, her lips tightening, her disappointment sharp and performative. "Do you think this is acceptable?" she asked, though the question was never meant to be answered. She ordered the laundress to kneel on the wet floor while she lectured her on gratitude, on duty, on the cost of negligence. The speech was familiar, rehearsed, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who believed her words were righteous. The laundress listened, her knees aching against the stone, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the tub beside her. She counted her breaths, the way she always did, focusing on survival rather than dignity. When the mistress left, the laundress remained on the floor long after the door closed. The heat pressed in, the fire crackled beneath the tub, and something shifted inside her. It was not sudden, not explosive. It was quieter than that. A realization, heavy and irreversible. The washhouse had taken everything it could from her. There was nothing left to lose within its walls. In the days that followed, the mistress's visits became more frequent. She seemed to take pleasure in asserting her presence there, in reminding the laundress of her power. She criticized relentlessly, finding fault where none existed, inventing slights to justify her displeasure. The laundress responded with obedience, her movements precise, her expression blank. But beneath that stillness, her thoughts grew sharper, more focused. She began to notice patterns she had once ignored. The mistress always came alone, always in the afternoon, when the rest of the household rested or attended to other duties, always when the fire beneath the tub burned hottest, when the water reached its most dangerous temperature. The washhouse door was thick, the walls solid. Sound did not travel far through steam and brick. These observations did not arrive with intent. They surfaced the way memories did, uninvited, persistent. The laundress did not plan, she did not scheme, she simply saw, and, once seen, the knowledge could not be undone. The city of Charleston continued its routines, oblivious. Church bells rang, markets opened, ships arrived at the harbor, carrying goods and news from distant places. The mansion prepared for another season of social gatherings, another cycle of cleanliness and display. Inside the washhouse, the fire burned as it always had, and the tub boiled, patient and indifferent. On the final day before everything changed, the mistress lingered longer than usual. She criticized a stain that no longer existed, demanded the re-washing of garments already clean, and reminded the laundress of her place with a softness more cutting than shouting. When she left, she paused at the door and looked back, her eyes cold, assessing. "You would do well to remember," she said, "that everything you have comes from my mercy." The door closed. The laundress stood alone in the steam, her hands submerged in scalding water, numb to the heat she had lived with for years. The fire crackled beneath the tub, steady and relentless. For the first time, she did not look away from it. Session 1 ends not with action but with inevitability. The wash-house, long a place of punishment and silence, had become something else entirely, a space where years of suffering had condensed into clarity. The city slept peacefully beyond its walls, unaware that within the steam and heat of that forgotten building, a boundary had already been crossed, one Charleston would never fully acknowledge and never forget. The days after that afternoon passed with a strange stillness, as though the washhouse itself were holding its breath. The laundress returned to her work each morning before the sun had fully risen, lighting the fire beneath the iron tub, while the city beyond the mansion gates stirred awake. The motions were familiar, almost ritualistic, stacking wood, striking. Flame, waiting for the water to begin its slow, ominous simmer. Yet something had shifted inside her. The heat no longer felt like an enemy alone. It felt like a presence that listened. She spoke to no one about it. Words had always been dangerous, and now they felt unnecessary. Silence had protected her for so long that she trusted it more than speech. Still, her eyes grew sharper, her awareness widening beyond the tubs and baskets. She noticed how footsteps sounded differently depending on who approached. She counted the rhythm of the household, the way certain hours emptied the corridors and others filled them. She learned, when the overseer took his midday meal, when the cook retreated to the back courtyard, when the younger servants were sent on errands that left the wash-house isolated, the mistress, for her part, seemed to sense the change without understanding it. Her visits became oddly deliberate. She lingered longer, watched more closely, her gaze no longer casual. There was suspicion there, though of what she could not have said. Perhaps she sensed the absence of fear, the way the laundress no longer flinched when criticized, no longer rushed in frantic apology. Obedience remained, but it had grown colder, more exact. Charleston hummed with rumors that winter. Talk of unrest drifted through kitchens and servant quarters in fragments, whispered and quickly silenced. Stories of runaways, of punishments, of things that had happened on plantations upriver. The mistress dismissed such talk openly, calling it foolishness, exaggeration, the product of idle minds. But she tightened her rules, restricted movement, demanded stricter order. Control, she believed, was best maintained by pressure. Inside the wash-house, pressure had always existed. The air pressed against skin, the work pressed against muscle and bone, the years pressed against memory. The laundress had lived so long under that weight that she recognized its shape. What was new was the way it no longer crushed her. It sharpened her instead. One afternoon, the mistress arrived earlier than expected. The laundress sensed her before she saw her, the subtle change in the room, the way the steam seemed to shift. The mistress stood near the door, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You take your time today," she said. The laundress lowered her head and continued scrubbing. The water was nearly at full boil, bubbles breaking the surface with soft, relentless pops. The fire beneath it burned bright. "Look at me when I speak to you," the mistress demanded. Slowly, the laundress lifted her eyes. It was a small act, almost nothing, but it drew an immediate reaction. The mistress stiffened as though struck by something unseen. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them thickened, heavy with heat and unspoken challenge. "You forget yourself," the mistress said at last. "No, ma'am," the laundress replied softly, her voice barely audible over the hiss of steam. It was the first time she had spoken back in months, and the sound of her own voice startled her. It felt steady, grounded. The mistress frowned, unsettled more by the calm than by the words themselves. She turned sharply and left without further comment, her footsteps quick, almost hurried. After that, the mistress did not enter the wash-house for several days. Orders were sent through others, criticisms delivered second-hand. The laundress noticed the absence keenly. It confirmed what she had already understood. The wash-house unsettled the mistress. It was one of the few places in the household not fully under her gaze, its heat and isolation working against her sense of control. At night, when the fire was extinguished and the tubs emptied, the laundress remained behind longer than necessary. He sat on the low stool near the hearth, the bricks still warm, and allowed herself to think. Not of escape, she had learned the futility of such dreams, but of balance, of how the world had always taken from her without consequence, of how the mistress spoke of mercy without understanding its meaning. She remembered stories told in whispers long ago, of justice that did not come from courts or laws, but from moments when power faltered. Those stories had once frightened her. Now they felt less like warnings and more like explanations. The next visit came suddenly. The mistress arrived alone, her mood sharp, her patience thin. She criticized the arrangement of baskets, the dampness of a sleeve, the presence of ash near the hearth. Each comment landed with the expectation of submission, of fear. The laundress absorbed them quietly, her hands moving steadily through the water. "You think yourself clever," the mistress said abruptly. "I see it in the way you move now. Do not forget who you are." The laundress did not answer. She watched the mistress's reflection ripple across the surface of the tub, distorted by steam and motion. The image wavered, stretched, dissolved and reformed. It struck her then how fragile the illusion of control truly was, how easily it bent under pressure. The mistress stepped closer, peering into the tub as if inspecting its contents. The heat forced her back a half step, and irritation flashed across her face. "Careful," she snapped. "You will ruin the cloth if you let it boil too long." The laundress nodded, though she made no move to adjust the fire. The water churned softly, obedient to its own laws. The mistress lingered a moment longer, then turned away, dissatisfied but unsure why. When she left, the laundress exhaled slowly, her breath trembling for the first time that day. That night, sleep did not come easily. The laundress lay on her narrow pallet, listening to the distant sounds of the house settling, the murmur of voices fading into silence. Images surfaced unbidden. The tub, the steam, the mistress's face reflected in the water. She did not recoil from them. She examined them, turned them over in her mind, searching not for courage but for certainty. By morning, certainty had arrived quietly, not as resolve, not as anger, but as acceptance. Some paths, once seen, could not be unseen. The days that followed unfolded with an eerie normalcy. The household prepared for an upcoming gathering, a small event that required extra laundering, extra polish. The mistress grew animated, her spirits lifting with the prospect of guests. She spoke sharply but with purpose, her cruelty momentarily masked by anticipation. The laundress worked longer hours, her arms aching, her skin blistered anew. She welcomed the pain. It grounded her, kept her present. The fire beneath the tub burned almost constantly now, fed without pause. Steam coated everything, blurring edges, softening outlines. The wash-house became a world unto itself, separate from the mansion and its performances. On the final afternoon of that week, the mistress returned to oversee preparations. She commented on the brightness of the linens, the crispness of the folds, her tone almost approving. Almost. Approval, after all, was not something she gave freely. "You may yet be of some use," she said, as if bestowing a gift. The laundress inclined her head, hiding the flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. The mistress turned to leave, then paused, her hand on the door. "Remember," she added, "I am watching you." The door closed. The laundress stood alone with the boiling tub, the fire crackling beneath it. She stared at the surface of the water until the world beyond it seemed unreal. In that moment, the wash-house no longer felt like a place of punishment. It felt like a threshold. Session 2 ends in silence and heat, with no action yet taken, but with the understanding complete. The forces that had shaped the laundress's life, cruelty, isolation, endurance, had aligned into something irreversible. The city of Charleston continued on, unaware that the calm it enjoyed was built upon a foundation already cracking, already beginning to give way. The morning light crept into the wash-house in pale ribbons, slipping through the high, narrow windows and settling on the stone floor like something hesitant and unsure. The laundress was already awake. She had not truly slept. Her body had rested, but her mind had moved through the night, retracing moments, sounds, glances. By dawn she felt hollowed out and sharpened at the same time, like a blade honed too long on the same stone. She lit the fire without thinking, her hands performing the motions they had memorized years ago. Wood, flame, breath. The tub began its slow journey toward heat, the water still calm, deceptively gentle. Steam would come later. It always did. Above her, the house was alive with quiet preparation. Voices drifted down the corridors, light laughter mixed with orders. The gathering would take place that evening. Guests would arrive in fine clothes, their carriages rolling up the drive, their shoes never touching the mud that clung to the servants' paths. The mistress would smile, perform kindness, speak of civility and order as if they were virtues she herself had invented. The laundress scrubbed linen already clean, her hands moving with unnecessary force. She thought of the mistress's words, the warning disguised as authority. "I am watching you." It echoed not as a threat anymore, but as confirmation. The mistress was afraid, not of rebellion, not of punishment or rumor, but of losing the invisible line that separated command from chaos. By midday, the heat inside the wash-house had grown oppressive. Sweat traced familiar paths down the laundress's back, soaking into coarse fabric. Her breathing slowed, measured, as if she were conserving something precious. Outside, the air was crisp with winter's approach, but inside it was always summer, always relentless. Another servant entered briefly to drop off a basket, avoiding eye contact. News travelled strangely among them, passed through glances more than words. The laundress sensed it in the stiffness of shoulders, the speed of footsteps. Everyone felt the tension, though few understood its source. A house built on silence could feel disturbance long before it could name it. When the servant left, the laundress allowed herself a moment to stop. She stood with her hands resting on the rim of the tub, feeling the vibration of the boil through iron and bone. The water roiled now, alive, impatient. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the heat fill her lungs. It burned, but it also steadied her. Memory rose uninvited, not the sharp ones of punishment or hunger, but softer fragments. Her mother's hands guiding hers long ago, the sound of water in a river far from Charleston, laughter that had once existed without fear. Those memories had survived everything. They had not been beaten out of her. They had waited. She opened her eyes again. The tub was ready. The mistress did not come down until late afternoon. When she did, she was dressed for the evening, her hair carefully arranged, her expression already set into its public shape. She carried herself differently when guests were expected, lighter, as though she were floating just above the ground. She entered the wash-house and paused, clearly displeased by the heat. "Must it be so stifling?" she said, waving a hand in front of her face. "The linens must be boiled thoroughly, ma." The laundress replied, her tone respectful, her gaze lowered. The mistress sniffed and stepped farther inside despite herself, inspecting the piles of cloth. She ran a gloved finger along one sheet, nodding slightly. Satisfaction flickered across her face before she masked it. "You will finish these before sunset," she said. "I want nothing less than perfection tonight." "Yes, ma'am." The mistress lingered again, as she had before. There was something she wanted to say, something pressing at her, but she could not find the right words. Her eyes moved around the room, noting the fire, the tub, the way the steam clung to the ceiling like a low cloud. "Do not forget your place," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. The laundress looked up. For a fraction of a second their eyes met. In that moment, the power in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. The mistress felt it. Her mouth tightened, and she turned abruptly, leaving without another word. The door shut. The sound echoed longer than it should have. As the afternoon stretched on, the laundress worked with methodical precision. Each movement was deliberate, each task completed without haste or error. Time seemed to bend around her, slowing, thickening. The wash-house existed outside the rhythm of the rest of the plantation now, its pulse set by fire and water alone. When dusk approached, the noise above intensified. Music was being tuned, chairs arranged, laughter rehearsed. The mistress would soon descend again, perhaps to check once more, perhaps simply to remind herself of her dominion. The laundress felt no rush. She fed the fire carefully, maintaining the boil. Steam wrapped around her like a shroud, blurring her outline. She was no longer certain where her body ended and the heat began. When the mistress returned, it was with irritation sharp enough to cut. Something had gone wrong upstairs, a missing ornament, a disagreement, a reminder that control was always fragile. She carried that frustration with her into the wash-house, looking for somewhere to release it. "This place is unbearable," she snapped. "Open a window." The laundress hesitated just long enough for the mistress to notice. Now the mistress insisted. The laundress crossed the room and pushed the window open. Cold air rushed in, clashing violently with the heat. Steam surged upward, thickening, reducing visibility. For a moment the room became a shifting white haze. "Careless," the mistress muttered. "Always careless." The laundress returned to the tub, her hands steady despite the change in temperature. The mistress stepped closer, too close, peering into the boiling water again. She leaned forward, pointing at a bundle of cloth. "That one," she said. "It's not clean enough." The laundress did not move immediately. She watched the mistress's reflection once more, distorted and unstable in the roiling surface. The steam-muffled sound softened edges. The world narrowed to heat, breath, and the space between them. "I said now," the mistress demanded, her voice rising. Something inside the laundress loosened, not snapped, not broke, but released. The moment had arrived not with drama, but with inevitability. Her hands reached forward, guided by years of obedience, twisted into something else entirely. What happened next unfolded without sound at first, as if the room itself refused to acknowledge it. The mistress cried out only once, a sharp, startled sound that dissolved into steam. The heat overwhelmed everything, sight, breath, thought. The laundress felt the weight shift, felt resistance and then a terrible yielding. Time fractured, seconds stretched into something immeasurable. The water surged violently, spilling over the sides of the tub, hissing as it struck the floor. The fire roared in response, hungry and bright. When it was over, the laundress stepped back, her chest heaving, her ears ringing. The steam thinned slowly, revealing what remained. The world rushed back in all at once, sound, smell, reality. She stood there, motionless, waiting for something she could not name. Fear did not come, neither did triumph. There was only a vast, echoing quiet. Above, the music began. The laundress cleaned herself with mechanical care, scrubbing her hands until the skin burned. She arranged the room as best she could, though nothing could return it to what it had been. The fire still burned, the tub still steamed. But the balance had shifted irrevocably. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, laughter rising and falling. No one came to the washhouse, no one noticed the absence yet. The laundress sat on the low stool by the hearth, her body finally shaking as the enormity of what had happened settled into her bones. She did not weep. Tears belonged to a world where grief was allowed. When she rose at last, she moved with purpose. The path ahead was unclear, but it existed. She had crossed the threshold. There was no returning to the person she had been. Outside, Charleston glowed with lantern light, unaware that one of its quiet foundations had collapsed. Inside the washhouse, the steam lifted slowly toward the ceiling, carrying with it a truth that would not remain buried forever. They came for her before dawn, when the city still slept beneath a thin veil of river mist, and the harbor lamps burned like distant stars. Boots crossed the yard with the confidence of men who believed the world arranged itself to their steps. A lantern swung, casting light through the washhouse window, where steam had long since cooled, and the iron tub sat quiet, innocent-looking, as if it had never known the heat of what it held. She did not resist when they took her. Resistance had been a language beaten out of her years ago, replaced by stillness. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, not for safety but for symbolism, a visible assurance that order had returned. As they led her away, the house behind her stood unchanged, its shutters closed, its balconies silent, already preparing to forget. Word travelled faster than the river. By mid-morning, all of Charleston knew that something unthinkable had happened. A woman of standing had died in her own washhouse. The details were vague, softened, rearranged. There had been an accident. A servant had been careless. Heat, steam, confusion. These explanations were offered quickly, eagerly, like blankets thrown over a body before anyone could look too closely. The laundress was placed in a holding room near the courthouse, the air cold and damp. The walls smelled of mildew and old fear. She sat on a narrow bench, her back straight, her gaze fixed on nothing. A guard watched her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, as if unsure whether to see her as a criminal or a cautionary tale. He said nothing. Silence was a fur. When the questioning began, it was not a search for truth, but a performance of authority. Men in dark coats asked the same questions again and again, changing their tone but not their intent. They wanted her to confess to something simple, something clean, an accident caused by ignorance, a lapse in judgment, anything that required no examination of the world that had shaped the moment. She answered plainly when she answered at all. Yes, she had been working. Yes, the water had been boiling. Yes, the mistress had entered the washhouse. No, she had not called for help. No, she had not screamed. The questions tightened, circling her like a net, but she did not flinch. Outside, the city adjusted. Invitations were rescinded, curtains drawn, conversations lowered. The mistress's name was spoken with reverence tinged with urgency, as if repeating it might restore her. Her husband's absence was noted only in passing. He was away on business, spared the immediate spectacle of grief. Others would grieve for him, loudly and publicly, as expected. The trial moved quickly. It always did when the outcome was already decided. The courtroom filled with spectators eager for reassurance that the world remained predictable. The laundress stood small at the center of the room, her plain dress a stark contrast to the polished wood and fine fabric surrounding her. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the judge. She looked inward toward a place where memory and resolve coexisted without conflict. Witnesses spoke of her quiet nature, her diligence, her obedience. These were offered not in her defense but as evidence of the shock. How could someone so meek commit such a thing? Others hinted at darkness, at temper, at something unspoken that might have been lurking beneath years of silence. The truth, that silence itself could become unbearable, remained untouched. No one mentioned the wash-house beyond its function. No one described the heat, the isolation, the way sound died within those walls. No one asked why the mistress had gone there alone. Context was inconvenient. The verdict was delivered with solemn efficiency. The words were heavy, rehearsed, meant to close the matter. Justice had been served, order restored. The laundress listened without visible reaction. When it was over, she was led away again, this time toward a future that narrowed with every step. In the days that followed, the wash-house was scrubbed until the stone floor looked new. The tub was emptied, its surface scoured until it reflected only light. Fresh lime was spread, windows were opened wide, the space was reclaimed, redefined, stripped of its story. Soon it would return to its purpose, the past sealed beneath routine. Yet stories do not disappear so easily. Among the enslaved, the tale moved quietly, shaped by whispers and glances, passed along in kitchens and quarters, at wells and along fences. Details changed, softened, sharpened. Some said it had been an accident, others said it had been a moment of madness. A few spoke of justice, though they used the word carefully, as if afraid it might hear them. Children were warned not to linger near boiling water. Women spoke of endurance and its limits. Men looked toward the wash-house with a new awareness, understanding that places built for labor could also become places of reckoning. The laundress herself became less a person and more a symbol. Her name faded first, replaced by description. The woman from the wash-house, the one who crossed the line. She existed in memory not as flesh and blood, but as a question. How much could be taken before something broke? And what happened when it did? Years passed. The city grew, changed, reinvented itself. New families moved into old houses. The wash-house stood, its stones absorbing fresh heat, fresh sweat. Those who worked there felt something they could not explain, a heaviness, a sense of being watched by history itself. They did not speak of it. Speaking invited attention. Records were filed away, labeled, forgotten. Official accounts remained neat and bloodless. An unfortunate incident, a regrettable loss, lessons learned, nothing more to be said. But at night, when the city settled and the air thickened with memory, the story lingered. It lived in the way elders paused before finishing certain sentences, in the way hands trembled briefly over boiling pots, in the understanding that power, when unchecked, could turn even the most ordinary spaces into sites of irreversible change. The laundress's fate was sealed, but her impact was not. She had not planned to become anything more than what she was. She had not sought legacy or legend. Yet in a single moment, shaped by years of cruelty and silence, she had altered the balance, exposing the fragile illusion beneath Charleston's polished surface. History would not record her complexity. It would not weigh the forces that pressed upon her until there was nowhere left to stand. It would simply mark the event and move on. That is what history often does. But buried stories have a way of breathing, even underground. They shift, expand, refuse to remain still. They wait for ears willing to listen beyond the official narrative, for eyes willing to see the spaces between facts. And so the wash-house remains, whether standing or fallen, its story folded into the foundations of a city built on labor and denial. The steam has long since lifted, but the heat remains, invisible and persistent, reminding us that, beneath every calm surface, lies the potential for truth to rise. In reflecting on this story, we are forced to confront not just an act, but a system that made such an act imaginable. It asks us to consider how suffering is normalized, how silence is enforced, and how history chooses which voices to preserve. The laundress did not leave behind a confession or a manifesto, only a moment that refused to be erased. In that refusal lies the true disturbance and the enduring lesson of a past that still echoes into the present. Thank you for listening to this untold chapter of history. This is Susa Buried Stories, where we uncover the truths hidden beneath time, silence, and stone. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about history's deeper layers. We invite you to comment below with your thoughts and reflections, and to stay connected with us for more stories that history tried to bury. Reach out, stay curious, and remember, some truths only surface when we're brave enough to look for them.